so around the time when this population started to take off, there was an economist called Thomas Malthus, right? So he was an Anglican cleric, and he lived from 1766 to 1834, right? And he died at the age of 68, and he had 3 children. So you might be like, well, why am I telling you that? I'm telling you it now just so you kind of get a bit of an idea of it later, right? So anyway, so Malthus, he basically had the theory that population grew at a logarithmic rate, right? So it grows exponentially. So basically, the way to think about it is, you end up having 2, then 4, then 8, then 16, then 32, right? However, he thought that food grew at an arithmetical rate. I think that's the right word, but whatever. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4. So basically, what he thought was that what would end up happening is that at some point, the population of the world would get to such a point that it would outstrip the food supply. Then you'd end up having a crisis, right? So basically, at this time, you have to think about, especially rich people, like kind of like in England at that time, or just rich people in general, they tended to look down on poor people, and they tended to blame their poverty like on their bad behaviour. And one of the things that they blamed on their bad behaviour was that poor people seemed to have a lot more kids, than rich people. So Malthus, as I said, he had 3 children, and the average kind of like poor person at this time had 5, 6, 7, maybe 8, maybe even more children, right? So he analogized poor people to rabbits, right? So basically, obviously the saying breeding like rabbits, that's what he basically thought of poor people. So he thought that, right, okay, if the human population continues to grow like this, what's going to end up happening is that these poor people are going to have more and more kids, and obviously we've got one planet, right, and there's only a limited amount of food. So what's going to end up happening is that everyone is going to end up having to fight for this small amount of food. And basically, we're going to get to a point where there's a crisis, where there ends up being famine, there ends up being a lot of turmoil. But eventually, you end up having a situation where, many of these people, maybe millions of these people, are going to die in. And by them dying, just like with rabbit populations, if rabbits in the field and like they run out of food, then what ends up happening is that all of them end up kind of suffering, and eventually a lot of them end up dying until you reach the equilibrium again for like what that plot of land can sustain in terms of rabbits. And that pressure point that we spoke about was known as the Malthusian trap, right? So he thought that all of humanity was basically heading towards this Malthusian trap. So in 1798, he outlined this theory, and he put it in what was known as an essay for the principle of population. And so this book ended up being very, very influential in terms of like how basically people at that time would think, and actually for quite a long time afterwards, it was actually very influential. So people in those days tended to have a very zero-sum attitude when it came to economics, and people even today now, like a lot of people who don't understand economics, will have a very zero-sum approach, right? So basically, with Malthus, he was basically arguing for protectionism, right? He was arguing for basically it's kind of survival of the fittest, a kind of, in a way, a kind of social Darwinist view, before Darwin even came up with his theory. So the idea is that, right, there's a pie or a pizza, whichever like makes you less hungry, and the idea is that it's, there's a fixed pie, and so if I end up taking more slices, then you will end up having less, right? And the same applies for countries as well. Like, so if one country becomes more powerful, then it has to do so at the expense of another, because there's finite resources, right? Now, any understanding of economics will show that that's completely wrong, right? Because in actual fact, it's not a zero-sum game, that if someone becomes richer, if a country becomes richer, it doesn't mean that it has to do so at the expense of another country. As a matter of fact, both people can become better off, and it doesn't cost anyone anything, right? So this is something which Malthus couldn't really see. So for some reason, people have said that he was a student of Adam Smith, but I don't really see how he was, because what Adam Smith, famous economist, the kind of like quote unquote father of economics, right? He basically argued for free trade. So the idea behind free trade is basically remove tariffs, so remove like kind of like taxes on imports, remove the barriers on trade and stuff, right? And then what will happen is that people will choose the best quality stuff at the cheapest price, right? So if that means that I have to get wheat, for instance, from England, or if I have to get from Spain or from Australia or Canada or wherever it is, right? It means that that's where we're going to get from, right? So that doesn't mean that my country is going to be poorer. It means that actually all of us are going to have a better standard of living. So in order to have this kind of mindset, it takes a bit of like outside the box thinking, right? And this is something which a lot of people, especially in those days, were not very capable of doing. So, for instance, this is why Thomas Malthus supported the infamous Corn Laws, right? So, from 1815 to 1846, they end up being in England, they end up being Corn Laws, right? So, these Corn Laws were basically protectionist policies, right? So, after the Napoleonic Wars, there was a big concern of like, oh, like if we don't like support British agriculture, then people are going to end up agriculture is going to go out of business, and then it's going to like harm like Britain because we're going to not be like self-sufficient, and we're going to have to get from foreigners, and what if there's another war and blah, blah blah. So out of fear of that, what they did is they artificially inflated the price of corn from the rest of the world. So they put tariffs on it. So this meant that if you were an English person at the time, a British person, wherever you're from, right, it meant that if you were buying things, right, it meant, that you end up having to have two choices. Either you buy a British corn, which is quite expensive and also might not be like a very good quality, or you could basically pay for something which either going to be the same price or more expensive, which is foreign, right? And it might be better quality, and in a normal like market scenario, it might actually be much cheaper. But because the price has been inflated by these extra tariffs, it means that now you're kind of being priced out of buying that, right? You're being discouraged from buying it. Whereas in a free market, right, people will go, right, okay, this stuff from America is much cheaper, it is much better quality, let's go and buy that. And therefore, poor people can afford to buy these things. This is the argument basically for free trade. And, his policies, Malthus's policies, later down the line end up having a huge effect on Ireland, right? So, obviously, you got the potato famine, which took place in 1845, and this really devastated Ireland. Now, the Corn Laws were repealed in 1846, partly because of this famine in Ireland. But a big reason why they end up being a famine in the first place, well, first of all, obviously they end up being the potato fungus, right? The thing is, just because there's a potato fungus, it destroyed the potatoes, shouldn't necessarily mean that there's a famine. Famines, in the modern era, famines are always man-made, because we have the means to solve the issue, but we just choose not to, right? So in the case there, right, as a part of a deliberate policy, it was decided not to help the Irish, right, because of three things. One, the Irish were poor. Two, the Irish were Catholic. And three, the Irish were Irish, right? So obviously the discrimination that the English upper class had in those days was that they disliked all three of those groups. And so they basically saw the famine as a sign from God, as punishment, for these Irish Catholics, right? You're breeding like rabbits, you're having too many people, so God has sent this famine to punish you guys and to set a warning, right, to not produce more kids, right? So the thinking of a lot of people in England at the time was basically, right, if we support people, if we support whether it's the poor in Ireland or whether it's the poor in our own country, right? If we help them, all we're doing is just kicking down the can down the road or making the situation worse. Because if we give these people more help, they're just going to use that and just have more kids, and then it's just going to mean that the food supply is even more stretched. So this was kind of the thinking of Malthus, right? And he actually ended up debating a lot with David Ricardo, who was a famous economist who was basically a protege of Adam Smith. So he was a free trader, and the two men kind of clashed a lot, right? But the thing is, what you can see from these debates is that Malthus didn't actually understand economics, and he couldn't understand what was happening in the world around him, which was suddenly change and was changing the food supply, right? So he saw the increase in population, and he couldn't understand what was actually causing it, and actually what would be the long-term effects of that. So that's what we're going to get into now. So as we've discussed in previous videos, Friedrich Bastiat was another economist, and he came up with the idea of basically the seen versus the unseen, right? So we're very good at seeing, what we see, but we're not as good as imagining what else there could be to see. So in other words, what we don't see, it's difficult for us to imagine, right? So, for instance, what Thomas Malthus could see at this time was that lots of people were being forced off of their land, and were having to come to the city and work in factories, and there was grinding misery and poverty and disease and all the rest of it, right? So that's what he could see. And he could see, the population of England had rapidly grown. So it had grown from 5.5 million in 1700, and by 1850 it had increased to 18 million, right? So almost like increasing by like 3 times as much, right? And so for him, he was very worried that this was the future that England was going down, right? Where you're going to end up having more and more people being born, etc., right? And they're going to be overcrowding, there's going to be disease, all these kind of issues. So that's what you could see, but what you couldn't see was that, agricultural innovations, right, had basically exploded during this time. So one of the main things of this, so we have to first of all ask the question of why were people being evicted from their land? Well, people were being evicted from their land because they weren't needed as much on that land. So during this time, the King of England wanted to raise more revenue, and so what he decided to do was that you're going to end up having, before this, you end up having like commons, right? So within our cities and within like certain bits of our countryside, we still have places known as commons, and you go to them now and they're basically like little parks, right? Now, back in those days, the commons were, well, as it implies, right? So if you had a cow, if you had a horse, you had whatever it was, right? You take it to the commons, and it wasn't owned by anyone, and your cow could just graze wherever, your horse could graze wherever, your sheep could graze wherever, etc., right? So in that kind of situation there, where there's nothing being fenced off, right? It doesn't make sense for someone to go out and plant things, right? Because if you go out and plant things, then a few hours later, a cow could come along and trample on it, or horse, like when it's when it's actually like grown and stuff, might go and trample on it and like eat it or whatever. So it didn't really make sense to really innovate, right? And it didn't make sense to really focus in on kind of agricultural innovations. However, during this time, because you end up having this land, the commons being sold off, to private landholders, right? These private landholders decided that, right, this is our land now, so what we're going to do is we're going to make it as productive as possible. So we're going to focus on making these land more productive. So we're going to use different farming techniques. We're going to use more fertilization. We're going to use more mechanization, etc., etc. So you end up having like the invention of the seed drill and many other things like this, right? And so as a result of all these different factors as well, right, you end up having the agricultural revolution. And the agricultural revolution end up leading in turn to the industrial revolution, right? So you end up having more mechanized farming as well, and etc., right? So this meant that the same amount of land could produce a lot more food, and therefore you don't need as many workers, and so these people are kind of, to quote a Scrooge, surplus population. Because actually, A Christmas Carol, which was done by Charles Dickens, the character Ebenezer Scrooge, he's basically a living embodiment of Malthusianism, right? For instance, where he talks about let the poor die and then it will decrease the surplus population. That's what he's basically referring to, right? This is what Malthusianism was in its rawest sense. It's basically just let the poor die. But actually, we don't. They don't need to die, right? Because with these new farming techniques, it meant that more food was being produced. It freed up people in the countryside, to then move to the cities. They then worked in factory jobs, and there's something that people always forget as well. Factory jobs pays more than agricultural work, and also as well, agricultural work is hard. It's sun up till sun down, right? In the factory, you're working for X amount of hours, but people very early on into the Industrial Revolution, right? People, if they went to these cities and it was really as bad as we imagine it being, and don't get me wrong, these cities were terrible, the factories were terrible, right? But people are rational, right? And people vote with their feet. So very quickly, if it wasn't a better alternative, people would have left the cities and gone back to the countryside. The fact is that people left the countryside to go to the cities because there was better opportunities for them in the cities. So this is when you're having the Industrial Revolution, and then with that, during this time there's the Scientific Revolution and the revolutions in medicine as well. And so as a result of all these things combined, you end up having a situation where the birth rates are very high, but the death rates start to really come down, right? And you're starting to see this now in the developing world, right? The countries which are opening up to trade, which are industrializing. It's easy to see the sweatshops and the like the overcrowding in the cities and the slums and all this kind of stuff, right? And all the pollution that's happening. But what's not being seen is like, oh yeah, these people are making rational choices and they're choosing to do that because they're going to have a standard of living which is higher and having more opportunities. And also, the land that they were working on before is now becoming more productive, right?